Welcome to this YSL Excel VBA tutorial. This fairly short video is going to give you a quick introduction to using the IF function in VBA. So the IF function is distinct and different from the IF statement, but we're going to begin with a really quick recap of the IF statement, which you're hopefully familiar with already. Then we'll show you a basic IF function and demonstrate how it's different to the IF statement, talk about how you can write nested ifs and nested ifs, which there will be a difference between those two, and then finally finish off the video with a practical example of using the IF function to separate sets of data into different worksheets. So let's get started. Let's start with a very quick reminder of how the basic IF statement works in VBA. This is something you've probably done countless times in the past, certainly if you've followed this video series so far, but it's going to be a nice way to contrast the IF statement with the IF function so you can see the differences. If you need a copy of this dataset, there'll be a link in the video description so that you can download it. And what we're going to do is create a very simple if statement that's going to calculate a success rating for our films based on the number of Oscars they've won. So if the film hasn't won any Oscars, they're a loser, otherwise they're a winner. It's a bit harsh, but there you go. And I thought it was quite a nice topical example as well, because today is the day of the 2017 Oscar ceremony, so there we go. So let's head into the VB editor. As usual, I can press Alt and F11 and begin a quick new module or insert a new module by right-clicking and choosing Insert Module. We'll create a quick subroutine here that's going to be called something like Basic If Statement, and I'll spell statement properly eventually. And then we'll have a couple of variables. So I'm going to say dim wins as integer, so that's going to hold the number of Oscar wins as a number. Then we'll have dim success as strings. So this one's going to hold the actual rating that we're going to generate, either the word winner or the word loser. I'm going to assume that I've already selected a cell, so in fact let's select one in code. Let's say range A2.select to begin with, and then I'm going to say wins equals active cell dot offset 0, 10, so it's 10 columns to the right where the Oscar wins value sits. Once I've stored the value of the Oscar wins in the wins variable, I can write a very quick simple if statement to assign a value to the success variable. I'll write this out as a block if, although I don't necessarily need to write it as a block if, but just to demonstrate the point, I'm going to say if wins is greater than or equal to 1, then I can say success equals winner, and excuse me, and then otherwise I can write else success equals loser. Finally, I can say end if, and just to display the results, I'm going to debug.print them to the immediate window. If you can't see that already, you can head to the view menu and choose immediate window, and I'll just say debug.print, and I'm going to say wins, success. And if I were to execute that subroutine at that point, I'll see that the film Jurassic Park, which is in range A2, has 3 Oscar wins and therefore is a winner. Now, hopefully none of that came as any great surprise to you whatsoever. You should have seen if statements used in the past, and you've hopefully written quite a few as well. Certainly you will have if you've been following this video series from the start. If it is the if statement that you're really interested in, we do have a separate video in this series. It's video number 13, which is about the if statement. But what I'd like to look at next is something called the if function. The reason we're going to look at the if function is because it's a wonderful little short succinct replacement for when you're trying to write an if statement that does something very simple like this. We've got a single logical test, and then all we're trying to do is generate a simple value, either a string or a number or a date, and return that to another variable. Now there's quite a lot of code. I appreciate it's not a huge procedure that we're writing here, but there's still quite a lot of code involved in generating this very simplistic result. So we could replace all of this with a quick simple if function. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all those lines of code and then comment them all out, and then just below that I'm going to write out my if function. So I'm going to assign the result of my if function to my success variable. So I'm going to say success equals, and then from this point on the if function operates an awful lot like the basic Excel worksheet if function. The only real difference actually is that it's spelt with 2 i's. If I press Control and space and look for the if function, so it's got a bit of a stutter, it's 2 i's in the spelling of if. But the parameter list is exactly the same as the parameter list for Excel's worksheet if function. So I can write out my logical test in the same way. I can say wins greater than or equal to 1, follow that with a comma to move on to the true part, and if that was true then I can write out the word winner, and if that was false I can write out the word loser. I can close the parentheses at that stage, and then if I were to run the subroutine again, perhaps let's choose a different cell as well. Let's just see what films we've got available. So let's choose Spider-Man instead, so that's A3, and if I were to run that one, Spider-Man's a loser because it didn't win any Oscars. If I choose A6, I know that film definitely did win some Oscars, so that one's a winner. So exactly the same sort of result, just in much less code. Now, I'll admit that I did exaggerate the benefits of using the if function ever so slightly by writing out a full complete block if rather than a simple inline single line if. So if I were to uncomment that code and change it so it's a single inline if, I can get rid of the end if and then take success equals loser onto a single line and then take else back onto a single line, essentially writing the entire thing out in one single continuous instruction. Now, even though that makes it a lot shorter, it's still more code to write this than it is to write this basic if function. So for simple things like this, I think if functions are a really useful tool. You can use the if function to create nested ifs as well. So let's say we wanted to extend our little system of rating our films based on their Oscar success. A winner is certainly a film which has won at least one Oscar. A loser should really only be a film that was nominated for but didn't actually win anything. Whereas we should have a third category, perhaps something like nobody, or not even considered, not even nominated, for films which didn't even receive a single nomination. So that means we've got 3 different categories, which means we've got at least 2 different logical tests to make. So if I were to go back to the VB editor and then make a quick copy of this first subroutine, let's paste that in down below, and then let's change its name so it's called something like nested if statement. What I'm going to do is add an extra variable that holds the number of nominations. So on the same line where I've said dim wins as integer, I'm going to type in a comma. I'll call my variable noms for short, noms as integer. And then I'm going to pick up the value of the Oscar nominations in a similar way to the way I've picked up the wins. If I just copy that line and paste it in immediately below, change the word wins to the word noms, and the number of nominations was only 9 columns to the right. So what that means, if I just comment out my if function line to begin with, and then if I wanted to maybe just rearrange my if statement so that I can put this back as a block if, that'll make it much easier to read and to work with. So let's say if wins is greater than or equal to 1, then it's a winner. Otherwise, it's not necessarily a loser. It's only a loser if the wins is not greater than or equal to 1, but the nominations is greater than or equal to 1. So there are several different ways I could achieve this. I could write an else if statement here. Alternatively, I could write a nested if. So I could say inside this first else, I could then begin another if statement, and then I can say if noms is greater than or equal to 1, then success equals loser. So that means that the film hasn't got any Oscar wins, but it has got at least 1 nomination, so it must be a loser. And then a final else, which will mean that the success is equal to, let's call it a nobody or a nothing. Nobody will do. Again, very harsh, but there you go. That's such is the world of Hollywood. That's what you get when you don't get nominated for any Oscars. We'll require 2 end ifs as well. I've written these out as 2 separate block ifs, so we'll need 2 separate end ifs to handle that as well. So, of course, this will work exactly as expected, I would hope. If I choose, let's say, cell A2, so that Jurassic Park was nominated for and won at least 1 Oscar, so I should probably print out the noms as well. So I should say, let's say noms, comma, wins, comma, success. Let's run that one more time. So we've got 3 nominations, 3 wins, and it is a winner. If that becomes number 3, Spider-Man. Spider-Man was nominated for 2 but won 0, so it's a loser. And then let's say number 7. That one definitely didn't get nominated for any Oscars for good reason. What a dreadful film. So 0 nominations, 0 wins. It must be a nobody. Now, just as before, we can replace this fairly long-winded, wordy if statement with a much more succinct if function. So let me just comment out the entire sequence of nested if statements there, and then I'm going to uncomment my if function. I've already got the beginnings of this, so I can say if wins is greater than or equal to 1, then it is a winner. Otherwise, I'm just going to drop in another if function. I'm going to nest another if function directly inside the false part parameter for the first if function. So just like you would in an Excel worksheet function if you wanted to nest ifs. So I can say IIf, I'll spell that properly, and then the expression this time would be noms greater than or equal to 1. So the logical tests work in exactly the same way as the logical tests for if statements. And if that's the case, then the film is definitely a loser because it was nominated for but didn't win anything. And then finally, the remaining one would just be nobody or nothing. I'll need to wrap up 2 close parentheses at the end because I've got 2 opened, of course, 1 for that if function, 1 for that if function. But the end result, once again, will be exactly the same. If I run this for Evan Almighty, that gives me a nobody. If it was for A3 Spider-Man, that's a loser, and of course for A2 Jurassic Park, that would be a winner. That really is pretty much all you need to know about the if function. It's very much just a direct replacement for simple if statements that are trying to return some kind of value, either a string or a number or a date. Do bear in mind that the if function isn't designed to perform actions, so unlike an if statement where you could write out a sequence of actual instructions to carry out, the idea behind an if function is that it returns a value, so either, as I say, a string or a number or a date. Bearing that in mind, let's maybe just try and put this into a bit of a practical example just to wrap up this video. So what I'm going to do is copy this entire subroutine nested if statement, and then I'm going to create a brand new module for this. And what we're going to do is write a routine, or if I just paste this routine in, I want to modify this so that rather than just listing out whether a film is a nobody, loser or winner, we take all the details for a film and write it out into a new worksheet. So we're going to have a separate worksheet for each one of these individual categories. So let's just tidy this up a little bit. Let me take away the if statement that we created earlier on, so we don't need that at all in this example. We'll use our simple if function instead. We'll change our subroutine's name as well, so I don't want to call it nested if statement. I want to call this one something like, let's call it list films by success. And then we can create a couple of extra variables in here as well. So I've got my wins and noms variables. I'll require both of those. I'd also like a variable that helps me to loop through the range of cells in column A. So I'm going to say dim r as range. I'd like to hold a collection, or at least an array, of the individual sheet names that I want to generate. So I'm going to declare an empty array called something like sheet names, open and close parentheses. And then I'd like to be able to loop over that array shortly as well. So I'd like to declare a variant variable, dim v as variant. Again, we've got videos on all of these different topics, so if you need more help, then we've got a whole tutorial series that covers all of these topics in a bit more detail. So, having done all of that, what I would like to do is, first of all, populate my array of sheet names by saying sheet names equals, and I'm going to use the array function, and inside there I'm going to write out 3 different sheet names which correspond to my winner, loser and nobody. So in fact, let's just cheat a little bit. Let's just copy winner, loser and nobody and all the associated text there, and then we can just cheat and get rid of the bit in the middle that talks about an if statement. So there we go, nice quick simple way to populate that array. I don't need to select range A2, so I can get rid of that line. What I want to do next is loop over this little array of names and either clear out the contents of a sheet that already exists with that name, or if that sheet doesn't exist, create it from scratch. So to do that, I'm going to use a for each loop. I'm going to say for each v in sheet names, and then say next v. And I think I'd like to create another subroutine that does the hard work of checking whether the sheet exists and either clearing it or creating it. So let's have a new subroutine. I'm going to call it clear sheet, and I'd like to be able to pass in the value of the current name that I'm looking at. So clear sheet v. So that means that I need to declare a new subroutine. So I'm going to say sub clear sheet, and this one has to have at least one parameter. Now I'm going to declare this parameter as by val. It's important that I pass the value of an element of an array by value rather than the default, which is by ref. And again, we've got videos that explain what the difference between by val and by ref is, but just know that it's important in this case to pass by val. So I'm going to say by val, and let's call this parameter something like sheet name. And then we can write a quick little bit of code in here that will first of all try to clear the contents of an existing sheet. So let's say worksheets, and then we can say sheet name in parentheses. So whichever sheet name has been passed in, I should declare that this is a string, I suppose, so make sure that's sheet name is string so we know what we're looking for. Then I can say .cells.clear, and then as long as that sheet exists, so as long as a winner, loser or nobody sheet exists, all the cells on that sheet will be cleared out. The problem, of course, is that if that sheet doesn't exist, then we'd end up with a runtime error. So to essentially detect whether the sheet exists, we're going to use some simple error handling. Again, we have a separate video on the error handling statements on error go-to. I'm going to create a quick simple label called create sheet. I can then copy that label, create sheet, and paste it in a bit further down in the subroutine, and really importantly I must type in a colon at the end of that label to make sure that it's considered as a label. So basically, if this line fails, this statement above it says go to this section here and perform any instructions. So I'm going to say worksheets.add, and then when you add a new worksheet, it automatically becomes the active sheet, and it also returns a reference to the sheet that's being created. So I can then subsequently modify the name property to be equal to the name of the sheet that I'm trying to create or clear. Okay, so a couple more things to do. Once I've created that new sheet, I want to make sure that I resume at the next line of code. So I'm going to say resume next. When I say next, it means the next line, or the line immediately after the one that caused the original error. And what I'm going to do there is write a statement that says on error go to 0, which is a little bit of a bizarre kind of arcane line of code that essentially says reset the error handlers back to their original status. Again, the video on error handling that's part of the main series gives you a lot more detail about what that's actually doing. I'm going to make sure then that I copy the column headings from sheet 1 into this new worksheet. So I'm going to say sheet1.range, and then the first cell containing a column heading is cell A1, followed by a comma, and then I'm going to say sheet1.range A1.end XL to right. So end, opens and parentheses, XL to right. So essentially that will make sure that no matter how many columns of data I have, this will refer to the entire set of columns. I'm going to say copy to copy all those column headers, and the location that I'd like to paste all of these, the destination, is the first cell in the sheet that I've either cleared or just created. So in short, that's worksheets sheet name dot range A1. Okay, phew. So at this point then, once I have looped over all of the sheet names in my sheet names array, I will either have a blank copy of an existing sheet that's called either winner, loser or nobody, or a brand new shiny fresh copy of one of those sheets. Okay, one last line that's important to put into this procedure is a quick exit sub, just to make sure that we don't run through into the error handling section regardless of what's been going on prior to that. Again, the video that's part of the Excel VBA introduction series on error handling will explain that in a lot more detail. So we can head now back up to the main routine and work out what we want to do next, which is basically looping through all the cells in column A, checking whether the film is a winner, loser or a nobody, and then copying that row of data into the appropriate sheet. Let's make sure we're only copying the correct number of columns first of all. I want to create a separate variable now that's going to hold the number of columns of data in that table. So let's say dim cols as integer. And then before we do anything else, I'm going to say cols equals sheet1.range A1.current region, which refers to the current, well, the entire region of cells that cell A1 belongs to, .columns.count. So that's nice and simple to do. We've then looped through our sheet names and either cleared or created them. So what we can do next is begin looping over the correct range of cells. So I'm going to say for each R, this time for each R in sheet1.range A2, which is the first cell containing a film name, comma sheet1.range A1.end XL down. That's one simple way to reach the bottom cell in the sheet. It does assume that there are no gaps in the list, but as I created this list anyway, I'm pretty sure that there aren't any gaps. I'm confident there aren't any gaps in that list. So bear in mind that there are limitations to that particular technique. I'm then going to pick up the number of wins and nominations, not from the active cell, but offsetting from the position of the R variable. So R is a reference to the cell that I'm currently looking at in column A, but I won't necessarily have that cell selected, so I can't use the active cell to reference it. Let's indent those two lines and indent the success line. That doesn't need any changes at all. That just works in exactly the same way as it did earlier on. But I don't want to just debug.print the noms, wins and success this time. Let's remove that line entirely and replace it with a line that's going to copy the range of cells into the appropriate sheet. So to do that, I'm going to say, first of all, r.resize to refer to the correct range of cells. So r.resize with a rows of 1 and columns equal to the number stored in the cols variable. So that's going to be 1 row and 11 columns in this particular case. Then I can say .copy. And to refer to the worksheet that I want to copy those cells to, I can say worksheets, and then I can refer to whichever value is stored in my success variable. So worksheets success, and then close parentheses, And now I'd like to reference the next available blank cell in column A. A couple of different ways to do this. Here's a quick and simple, slightly, well, it's not the most elegant way, I should say, to do this, but I'm going to basically refer to the very bottom cell in the entire worksheet, which since Excel 2007 has been a 1,048,576. And then from there I can say .end XL up, which will bring me right back up to the very top of the sheet, to the next populated cell in the upwards direction. And then from there I can just say .offset 1, 0, and that will refer to the next available blank cell in column A. All I need to do then is say next R to move on to the next cell in the sheet 1 worksheet. And then finally, just to do a tiny little bit of tidying up, let's loop through the range of sheets whose names are contained in my array using another for each loop. So in fact, I'm just going to copy and paste this. Bearing in mind that I might create new worksheets from scratch, all those sheets will have the default column width, which might make it a little bit awkward to read the results. So let's say for each V in sheet names, let's say worksheets v dot range a1 dot current region. No IntelliSense to help me with this, but I've typed this out enough times that I should know. Dot entire column dot auto fit. So that will just change the column widths of that entire region of data to be the correct width. So one just final quick check over this. All looks good. Let's give the entire thing a quick test to make sure we end up with these new worksheets with all our individual films separated out as winners, losers and nobodies. So we could have a quick look back in here. So here's all the films with no nominations and no wins. That's the nobody sheet. And we could have a look on the loser sheet, and that's the films with nominations but no wins. Particularly disappointing for Gangs in New York. Look, 10 nominations, not a single win. Travesty. And then finally the winner sheet, which are the films with well, obviously they must have nominations in order to have won an Oscar, but these are the films with the Oscar wins. So there we go. Hopefully you found that useful. Hopefully if you've not encountered the if function before, you'll find some places where you could replace some slightly more long-winded if statements with some slightly shorter, simpler if functions now. Thanks for watching. See you next time. If you like what you've seen here, why not head over to the WiseOwl website, where you can find loads more free resources, including these videos, some written blogs and tutorials, and even some exercises that you can download to practice your skills. Thanks for watching, see you next time.